So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the show.
I'm LB Dia.
And I am Lance P. Myers, and this is episode 3 of the Persistence of Vision podcast.
Persistence of vision? What the hell does that mean?
I love that question.
That's why I continue to ask it.
Images flashed on the retina and processed into vision by our brains tend to linger, then blend with the next incoming image. This is how and why we are able to perceive movement and make sense of our ever-changing world, LB. That's how cartoons work.
And Persistence of Vision Publishing, what's that?
Another great question. Persistence of Vision Publishing is an Austin-based company dedicated to bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking, conversation-stimulating material. If you check the website now, which is pov-publishing.com, you can read poetry by 1 E. Myers, W. Joe Hoppe. You can read sequential art and comics by Walt Holcomb and Penny Van Horn, and read about the soon-to-be-released work of literary fiction, my novel, Why So Much?
Book release party, you say?
Sure.
When is the party?
The party is going to be June 8th, I think. Right. It takes place June 8th at Malvern Books in Austin, but the book is already available for pre-order at Amazon.com. Just look for a book called Why So Much by me, Lance Myers.
And that is June 8th, 2019, for
Correct.
all you listeners of the future.
That's right. That's right. But enough about the future. Let's talk about the present.
Yes, we have a guest with us, Mr. Professor Timothy Braun. Mm-hmm. Playwriting professor. Or not playwriting.
Technically, I am the visiting assistant professor of creative writing in the English program, the English language program at St. Edward's University. So I teach playwriting, I teach screenwriting, I do teach intro to creative writing, which means I ultimately teach short story writing and also poetry and things along those lines.
Fantastic.
And we have a fantastic gaming program, so all of the gamers now have to take my classes to look at story arc and character development, and in the process, I'm now teaching a lot of gaming stuff, which I never thought I'd do, which is a lot of fun.
Interesting.
Well, that sounds like you are the perfect person to talk about Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because I didn't, when we talking about this book, I didn't realize it came out in so many different forms.
Yes. From what I understand, the initial idea, of course, he got the idea for Hitchhikers by actually hitchhiking. I'm serious. He was actually hitchhiking through Belgium at that point in time.
This is Douglas Adams.
Mm-hmm. And that's where he got some of the principal ideas. But he had multiple ideas as well for this book to be a radio show. A lot of people have tried to adapt it to be a game. As I said, with the gaming majors that I've talked to. Of course, it's been adapted into a BBC television show and movies and things along those lines. It's also been adapted into a stage play. This was something that Douglas Adams was very interested in. He wrote for Monty Python, Flying Circus.
That makes sense.
Yeah, which makes an awful lot of sense. He did write a great deal of sketch theater and sketch comedy at that point in time, but this was his first of many pretty severe hits. He does have the distinction of being the first and one of only 2 members of, or at least people who are not members of Monty Python, to be credited as a writer in one of their shows, and even shows up as an actor. He shows up in a Monty Python episode as a doctor.
Is that right?
Definitely one for you to check out.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm. He was an imposing-looking gentleman, I gather.
Mm-hmm. He was about 6'5", of course. Or as Americans would say, 6'5". Over there, he's X number of meters. He towards the late 80s and early 90s, he fleshed out a little bit of tummy, as we all know, and looked a little more like a jolly, not quite Santa Claus, not quite like that, but almost like a Will Ferrell style kind of character that you would find. Was very much into environmentalism, would hike mountains dressed as a rhino to bring attention to well, what's happening to our rhino friends? Of course, going down the level of extinction and poaching and things along those lines.
Nothing good.
So, yeah.
So he did all these things before writing this book, or before
He
doing the
actually
radio?
used his fame from this book that ultimately launched off those other projects.
I see.
Of course, multiple Hitchhiker books. He was notorious. One of his, I think, best quotes, for my money at least, is that I love deadlines and the sound they make as they go zooming by me. I'm actually butchering the quote right now, but he was notorious for what he described as writer's block and how he would try to fist fight his way through it. And missing deadline after deadline after deadline. So with the level of success with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and multiple versions that came, or at least sequels, if you will, The Restaurant to the End of the Universe, and Life, the Universe, and Everything, Mostly Harmless, and things along those lines.
So long and thanks for all the fish.
So long and thanks for all the fish. He also, that's after that is when he started doing Dirk Gently, the holistic detective, and his whole series, which have this similar level of postmodern, rather existential humor that you really need to taste. To understand the books, the writing style, some of the things he's trying to say.
So this is not actually a guide for hitchhikers. It's a
not.
Novel. It's a story.
No. And also being very politically motivated and active. What I think of this book as a classic, for multiple reasons, is that it touches on so many things that we've been wrestling with for, since we were telling stories around a campfire in Ethiopia and things along those lines. Well, what is the meaning to life, the universe, and everything? Of course, the answer in Hitchhikers, spoiler alert, is 42. Yeah. We're just not asking the right question. But the very beginning of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it essentially starts off with gentrification. We come across a main character who his home is going to be destroyed in the name of progress and in the name of a bypass. And then his friend Ford, Arthur's the main character, at least for many of us, says, come here, let's get a drink, because we're going to hitch a ride. We got to get out of here. And it says, well, Earth in itself was in the way of an intergalactic highway. We've got progress, and we're going to plow you guys down and ultimately try to open up these kinds of things. And if you were to be, let's say, just about any city right now, of course, Austin has a pretty serious confrontation right now with gentrification, but so many cities in the United States do right now. So many places in England have these kinds of issues as well. These are classic ideas that go, well, you can go all the way back to things like Christopher Columbus, the Romans, anything along the lines of, well, the Romans are probably be a very, very good example because they were so good at building roads and taking things over from it. So,
it seems like the part of the gentrification, well, part of them knocking out his home has to do with gentrification, but also the fact that, okay, so it mirrors the fact that, like, just a chapter later, they're actually destroying the Earth to make way for the intergalactic bypass or whatever it is. But also, it seems like the British have this need or want or, like, penchant to, like, parody bureaucracy.
yes.
Like I'm seeing, like in Terry Gilliam's, a lot of Terry Gilliam's work is like based on that sort of thing.
And this was, of course, post World War II, when British humor really began to change an awful lot. You've seen the British Empire not completely and totally crumble, but all of a sudden they weren't the top dogs that they were as they were slowly beginning to fall apart in the 1800s. And then after, of course, having to deal with some of the horrific things of World War II, having, consistently having bombs dropped on them by the Nazis and really trying to stand strong in the process of some of the bureaucracy, you get sort of a cheeky, really absurd sense of humor. There's one line in the book that I always go back to, and it's about a ship. And it says, the ship hung in the air, much in the way bricks don't.
That's right.
And I thought,
I love that one.
Yes, that's just absolutely perfect in the way this rather, existential, really leading us into postmodernism. And then going back to things, of course, like Monty Python and how they've approached not just their movies, but their television show at St. Ed's. I used to team teach a philosophy and literature class with a guy, and where we would show our students there's the Philosopher's Soccer match every year.
Yeah, that's a classic.
Classic, and of course that's just classic Python, and you can really see a lot of that. All those influences really come out of
The
this
Philosopher's
book
Soccer
as well.
match is a skit from Monty Python that's in the Hollywood Bowl. And it shows a soccer match with a commentator talking about what's going on the field, but of course all the players are famous philosophers instead of regular footballers.
Some good stuff, man. I grew up just loving Monty Python's Flying Circus. But I had never read this book until
really?
we decided to interview about it. So I'm coming to this completely fresh. I read it, I finished it a week ago.
Okay.
And so all of this is brand new to me. I'm a big Vonnegut fan, and I saw a lot of similarities to Sirens of Titan.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that book, Sirens of Titan?
Yeah, I myself am a huge Vonnegut fan as
Yeah.
well, and I think that he, for my money, Douglas Adams was sort of the British answer to Vonnegut, a very wry sense of humor, but we're opening up other ideas as well that are very universal. I think they very much go hand in hand.
Right.
You can even see just the concept of things like the way they manipulate time and space and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and again, its sequels, can go into things like Slaughterhouse-Five or Breakfast of Champions. They're all standing on the shoulders of one another. How I came to this book, I came to it when I was about 5.
Is that right?
But I came to it through a radio show. They were doing BBC radio shows in the early 80s. Douglas Adams and a handful of people, they typed them up, and they did well for the young folk out there in podcast land. Before we had podcasts, we had radio shows. But the BBC did an exceptional job of knowing how to show but don't tell with the radio show. And my dad would record them on good old-fashioned cassettes, and we would listen to them in car trips to my grandparents. And so I was immediately inundated just by the sound of these guys and the punchlines that are happening. And then ultimately, when I was in middle school, I really gave it a crack. I said, all right, let me see if I can read it. And then there's new layers upon layers. Fun thing about the BBC radio show, I'm sure you can get your hands on it. It's not only an exceptional radio show, but the actor they find to play Zaphod Beeblebrox is the only person that has an American accent. And I have no evidence on what I'm about to say. I'm just guessing that everybody else is, of course, has a British accent. But when you find the most audacious, pompous person, he's the president of the universe, or at least, and he steals the heart of gold. It's something about that. I've always wondered, were you guys trying to make some kind of very sly...
Very audacious. And he even blocks off part of his mind.
Yes.
On purpose so that he won't question himself and these things.
Something with two heads. And it's I don't know. I wonder what you guys are trying to say with that.
It's interesting you talk about the history of the British Empire, and you talk about comparisons with Vonnegut. When you see Douglas Adams and Monty Python, this whole period... much more philosophical, much more explicitly philosophical type of comedy, an intellectual type of comedy than would probably fly today. You don't see, and Woody Allen is another example.
Yeah.
Tons of references to, classic literature and famous philosophers and things like that in the comedy. I wonder if it has anything to do with World War II. I mean, that was my initial impulse. Maybe it doesn't make any sense, but for someone who grew up in World War II, the idea of your house being destroyed and then the earth being destroyed has a certain vividness if you've actually been under bombs,
And that's actually why I often come back to Vonnegut as well, because I think that his time in World War II, it's pretty obvious he wrote heavily about it, that if it wasn't for him in that meat locker, in Slaughterhouse-Five, Vonnegut said when he came home from World War II, his uncle said, you're essentially a real man now. You've seen war, and if you killed a guy, and he said, if I kill you, you'll be the first German I kill. You'll be the first anybody I kill. And of course, not to completely steer off the Douglas Adams road here, but that's why Vonnegut ultimately went to University of Chicago, and he was studying anthropology. And I think his Cat's Cradle was supposed to be his big dissertation and thesis. I think I probably should know that. But I think that impact of how horrible that war was, and before I came over here, I was spending time with my elderly dog and trying to do a little bit of laundry, and kind of sort of watching a basketball game while I was reading or grading papers. And right now I'm grading papers of where I ask my students the question, what is funny? And when do we cross a line on what's funny? When did it become offensive? When does it become hurtful? We go...
Ironically, it's exactly the same time.
Yeah.
It becomes offensive and hurtful is when it becomes funny.
and I ask them to use definitional argumentation, and we look at the Charlie Hebdo shootings of almost 4 years ago now for drawing the Prophet Muhammad. We look at South Park, but they have to do research that goes back to the Greeks. They look at... it was Carl Jung's book on jokes, when he was trying to analyze what makes us laugh and why. And consistently, when I go back to Douglas Adams and this rather wry British sense of humor, okay, we've watched our empire start to unwind but not completely crumble. We've stabilized, and we don't have to be the top dog in the world, which was probably quite humiliating, but you're able to turn in and have some self-reflection. And when I go back to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I consistently get this idea of some kind of self-reflection of who we are, why are we here. That's what, of course, 42 ultimately leads to.
Well, that's what made me feel like it was such a companion piece to Sirens of Titan. And again, here's more spoiler alert for you. It's the main gist of Sirens of Titan. Have you read that, LB?
I have not.
In the end, humanity is just a conduit. They were pretty much the entire civilization was created in order to give this alien, this stranded alien, instructions on how to fix his ship. And in Hitchhiker's Guide, the human race is built as a computer to try to find this particular answer. It's like trying to find a meaning for life, or kind of demonstrating that it really has nothing to do with. Or we're way off base. We don't know why we're here, but we're almost here like incidentally, like as a tool for someone else to figure something out.
And you've also got some really interesting humor like that in the movies of this time, because in the late 70s, when you're taking a look at if you take a look at the movie Meatballs, which was written by Harold Ramis, about how there's all this pressure on how important everything can be when you're a teenager. Meatballs, spoiler alert, is that it takes place at a summer camp, and it's basically the rich kids versus the poor kid camp. At the end, they're going to do some kind of Camp Olympics. And Bill Murray, at the night before they all start, he starts chanting with the kids, "It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter."
And one of the great things about that scene is that he never, in any sense, tries to justify that statement.
No.
He doesn't say it doesn't matter because X, Y, or Z. He just points out that, of course, it doesn't make any difference whether they win this event the next day.
And in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when Ford is first showing Arthur what's going on with this guide, and they come back to humans, or we come down to Earth, and it says harmless. Yes. And of course Arthur is somewhat offended, and then the new edition says mostly harmless.
Right. Yes.
And it's like, really, at the end of the day, when we're looking at the gigantic grand scheme of things, this big black thing around us with stars and how do we all fit in? Do we fit in? Why are we here? There's multiple layers that we can possibly adjust, but then maybe at the end of the day, go back to Meatballs just to get your sanity.
Yes. Well, I read the book in 6th grade and then reread it a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised by how literary it was. I think that is a pretty apt comparison to Vonnegut in that sense. It's very silly, but it's not it's not like a parody of science fiction. It is science fiction. It's hard science fiction. You clearly have an intelligent, creative person grappling with the nature of star travel and things like that, if it were possible, and what would a galactic civilization actually look like. I mean, of course, it's a parody of a galactic civilization, but it's very, very carefully thought through, and the writing is quite rich.
Yeah. And although wacky, it feels as though none of it is forced. That's really hard. That's really hard to do as a writer. And I know you guys know this quite well, is that sometimes you're really trying to find out what you're trying. You know what you want to say, you just don't know how to say it. I see this all the time with my students, and of course I never go through this. Oh no, it's every time I look at one of my plays. I'm working on a new one right now, and there's a scene that just sticks out like a sore thumb for some reason. It just doesn't quite feel like this is the world I'm trying to build. This is natural with the characters. The one thing that comes back to me when I think about this is, although he struggled with what he described as writer's block and trying to push through these kinds of things, all the wacky stuff, mice and dolphins and the pan-galactic gargle blaster, it all seems to fit. Even Zaphod, when he comes in. When I was a kid, I thought, wow, this guy is just crazy and amazing and all these kinds of things. And now as I look back upon it, it just seems to fit so well, and you're tackling gigantic topics and issues at the same time. It's really something.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that lends that literary quality, as you say, is the scope of what he's accomplishing, what he's trying to examine and envision and describe to us. You know, it's just, he's describing a planet where they make planets.
Yeah.
And they basically can do absolutely anything if you have the money to pay for a planet. So they have like something that's analogous, I would say, to a display room, or what do you call it? A
showroom.
Holodeck.
Yeah,
it's a showroom.
Yeah, and there's a planet that's made entirely of gold, and it's just extraordinary. You know, the imagination of the work.
But it doesn't feel completely driven by these, like kind of novel ideas, the way I feel a lot of science fiction is, where a lot of science fiction is like, okay, let's explore what it would be like if this technological advancement occurred, and what would human civilization do around that, or how would that drive, where we're going and that sort of thing. I feel like this is so much more about just real human problems, real human conundrums, real. Do you know what I mean by that?
I think the best science fiction is, personally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is that on occasion I look at science fiction and say, okay, you had a concept and then you forced your characters through it.
Right.
It's why we love Star Wars, because you can strip away the laser swords and the droids and all those kinds of things, and ultimately, I understand this character. I understand Han Solo. You've got a heart of gold, but you're actually a scoundrel on the outside to protect yourself. You're like every 17-year-old boy I've ever come across. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And with this, one of the more hilarious and yet very human characters is the android, Marvin the Paranoid Android. And he really does come across, at least on the surface to me, this is silly. But I know people like this. An android isn't supposed to have, these kinds of depression and worry.
You can feel this android's pain even through its his attempts to make light of them or to channel them into bizarre question asking.
It's funny you mentioned Woody Allen. The three things that came to mind when I was reading this were Vonnegut and Woody Allen, because I have several of his books too, which is very highbrow humor in this sort of way too, but also Lewis Carroll.
Oh yeah.
Dealing with paradox in logic and that sort of thing.
I consistently come back to, and definitely there's a political statement with this, but when I do think of Lewis Carroll connecting to Douglas Adams, I think of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trog that is so terrifying and so nasty and all these kinds of things. and yet it's so stupid. You can take the towel, wrap it around your head because it's so stupid that it thinks that if you can't see it, it can't see you. And it's like there's so many times I've been at, let's say, the DMV getting my driver's license taken care of or something like that. I'm like, here's the level of bureaucracy that we brought up earlier. We can see these very human things. We can see that DMV worker as the horrible creature who ultimately I'm pretty certain I can out trick and not die at the end of the day. And then
No question.
I of course bring up the best you can possibly come up with. The simplistic towel. It's the greatest thing you got for so many reasons. So
The towel in the book is the ultimate resource or the ultimate accessory to any hitchhiker. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, the towel, as they say in the book, is that you're on one planet and you've been swimming, it can dry you off. You're on this other planet. He mentions that when it's cold, you can use it as a blanket. You can use it in so many different ways. And I have to admit, I have a towel in my my car right now. I was just thinking about that.
So it is a little bit of a guide for hitchhikers.
Yeah.
For the
a little
rest of
bit.
us.
Yeah.
Well, with as much as it mentions the Hitchhiker's Guide, it actually kind of surprised me what a small role that actually played in the stories. And maybe disagree with me here, but I felt like after reading it, I thought, why is it called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and not like Heart of Gold after the ship that they steal? It seemed like there'd be so many more other things that would be central to the story that they could call it. Why do you think they?
Would you read a book called Heart of Gold?
Well, yeah,
Maybe.
good point.
I guess
Good
if it
point.
was really well repeated, but it doesn't sound funny.
I think the idea too is, again, he got the idea for the book while hitchhiking, but Arthur is forced into hitchhiking with his friend, and Ford is a hitchhiker. And when I talk with my students, I turned 44 a week ago.
Happy birthday!
Thank you. Plug for Timmy. But I'm at the age now of where when I want to travel, I want to end the night in a place that has a nice bed, and there should, for my money, there should be a bar, and that bar should have a lovely cocktail that has ice in it, and on occasion, I really sometimes a younger person will when I get to those places, they will help me with my bag. I like that when I tell my students, I'm now a tourist. When you're in your 20s, when I was just getting out of graduate school, and actually right before graduate school, too, I was bumming around Ireland with a bag on my back. I weighed quite literally about 40 pounds less than I do now. I like my rosé now. I like to sit on my porch with my old dog, But I would stay in youth hostels and get into all kinds of adventures, and I've got all kinds of stories. One time I was in Dublin, and I did not know this, but it was Bloomsday, the day that Ulysses takes place on, of course. And I was in Temple Bar, basically Dublin's version of the West Village, if you will. And I was at a youth hostel, and one of the people I was sharing a room with had 4 people. She was a architect assistant from Switzerland, and had an extra ticket for the Bob Dylan Van Morrison concert up in Belfast, and wanted to know if I'd like to go with her. That's what happens when you're bumming around and you're hitchhiking all over the place and things like that.
Yeah, and Belfast was a rough town back then too, right?
In the late '90s, it's when the peace talks were going on. So that was a fun time because it was also during the World Cup. So to be in a country that takes it as seriously as they do, it was fun times. Yeah, I can't do that anymore.
So you're saying that like a hitchhike, like to even reference hitchhiking, seems to sort of conjure adventure.
Yeah,
in a way, maybe Heart of Gold wouldn't.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we should get to our questions here because and we've been asking questions, but we have we've sort of installed a set of canons
New recurring event, right?
Yes, a set of cannons that will fire a battery of questions, and that set of cannons.
This is the lightning round.
Yes.
Yes.
I understand.
We've reached the lightning
you have
round.
3 lifelines, including phone a friend. But why don't you go ahead?
All right. Okay. Number 1 of our battery of questions for every guest from here on out, I think, maybe. When was the first time you remember falling in love with a book?
I think it's going to be this one.
Is that
really.
right? Okay. Yeah. 'Cause you said 5 years old, right?
Yeah, and that was through the radio show. But then after picking it up, when I was in middle school and I picked this up, I was kind of being forced into reading the stuff that middle schoolers are supposed to read, and it's Where the Red Ferns Grow, which is fine. It's not bad, but this one had adventure, excitement, silliness, and I thought, this is what novels can be like. This is really fascinating stuff.
So Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What about, has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
It was Slaughterhouse-Five. And actually, we brought up, because we were talking about Vonnegut earlier, I have read Breakfast of Champions more than once. As a teenager, I read it and I just thought it was cool. Then I read it in my 30s, and it was a completely different way of looking at the world.
Right.
People. It meant something totally different when I started losing my hair and my beard turning gray and those kinds of things.
Great God.
No.
Enough. Speaking of which, has a book ever made you cry?
Oh, yeah. Lots do. I teach a book in a literature class called We the Animals. Came out a couple of years ago. It's a novella.
We don't allow crybabies on our show.
Okay, I will. You know what?
I'll
just see myself out.
Wrong answer.
That was, I'm embarrassed.
No, please go ahead.
I don't know when this podcast is going to be coming out. One of my favorite books that I continually go back to is called The Little Prince. And one of my friends, he's got a 2-year-old son, and he just turned 2, and I was going to send him some kind of like clock, like animal clock, because he's learning how to do things like tell time and all that kind of stuff. And instead, I'm going to send him a copy of The Little Prince, because I write a lot, as Albie knows, about my relationship with my dog. I have 5 tattoos, and 2 of them are quotes from The Little Prince about his when the prince comes across the fox, and the fox has a couple of very smart comments to make that I'd like for the president to maybe I'll read it to you.
Yes.
Yeah, kind of things.
I think the audience would love to know what your dog's name is and what the dog is like.
The dog, his name is Dusty Danger Dog. I started writing about him 7 years ago. The first essay that I had built around him was published by the Modern Love column in New York Times.
Wow.
In the process, he has been cartooned by the New York Times, as have I, but his cartooning is much better than mine. Mm-hmm. I've written 28 stories about him. He ran for president against Trump and Hillary Clinton for Huffington Post.
I remember that.
Our first big adventure was after he started getting a little bit of notoriety. I've studied social media a lot. I am really tired of it, to be honest with you. But I felt like we were all getting into small bubbles, and my dog is very friendly. He's he's half Siberian Husky and half Blue Heeler. Mm-hmm. He's got one blue eye and one brown eye, and he's very friendly. So I wanted to travel the country in the summertime when I wasn't teaching to see if I could learn more about America. And so he's been to 28 states.
Wow. He's
been an artist in residence at Jurassic in California. When I say artist, he's a writing partner. Mm-hmm. He was also at Piedmont College, gave us a residency to do some work out in Georgia as well. He has the great distinction, we have the great distinction of, we were kicked out of the GM building in Detroit when we were beginning to ask questions about where the bailout money went, because Detroit in downtown is still a little iffy. He's marched in the Coney Island Mermaid Parade as a guest of honor. The guest of honor.
Was he?
He wasn't the captain or whatever. But it was just a special guy.
Was he decent? Was he nude or?
He was.
There's a lot of nudity.
He had his collar. He had a collar on.
Okay, good.
And if you, every August 17th here in the city of Austin, you can raise a glass or a slice of Home Slice, his favorite pizza, mind you. That is the day that Mayor Steve Adler proclaimed Dusty Dog Day.
Wow.
And so we have a proclamation as well. He's 15 now and really can't move his legs very well. So it's a lot of laying on the ground, laying on the porch, not really bothered by much anymore, but it's very peaceful. Watch movies a lot together.
Nice.
He watches me grade a lot. Yeah, and then we will. I always debate whether we should watch Game of Thrones together because it's violent. You don't want that with a dog's life. So.
Well, question number 4. How has fame changed your dog?
I'm sorry.
How did fame change your dog?
It didn't. He was.
Does he
always,
know he's famous?
I don't think so. But he is. He is kind of goofy. He actually is somewhat aloof as well. So when we had our big day 2 years ago, when we first had August 17th named after him. We had a pretty big party. We invited a lot of people in, and there was a game room for kids in my condo, and we have swimming pools. It was catered by our favorite pizza, Home Slice, which I'm sure after this will want to sponsor your podcast.
I hope so, God damn it.
Yeah, and we had a lovely time, and just as everybody was having a lot of, I put together a concoction called Danger Juice, and it was basically just fruit juice, and then you could add some Tito's vodka to it. And as everybody was starting to loosen up an awful lot, he seemed annoyed, and he just kind of went off to the corner and laid down and went to sleep.
That's exactly how I am at parties. As soon as people start enjoying themselves, I go lie down.
Well, that wasn't actually question number 4. Question number 4 reads more like, what's a book you've read more than once? I think you've already answered that, though. Hitchhikers, Little Prince, Slaughterhouse-Five, as always. I'll go just take us down a different beaten path. Sam Shepard's collections, various collections of short stories, I think are exceptional. I actually think they're better than his plays. And I will be happy to argue that on another podcast. But if you've never read some like the Motel Chronicles, it's when he's trying to figure out how to be a writer, and he's just telling what's very clearly autobiographical things. Some of the writing's a little messy and sloppy, but at the same time, he leaves open a great deal of room for you to bring your imagination to what's happening. Those are all quite good, in my opinion.
Excellent.
And do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Poetry committed to memory. I knew you were going to ask something like this.
Do you happen to know the one about the man from Nantucket?
I have heard this one. As far as poets are concerned, I have to admit I'm not very good at memorizing poetry. I do have a student in my introduction to creative writing class right now who is really struggling. And I called her into the office. She's struggling with just a handful of things. Life, 19-year-old, sophomore and internship and all these kinds of things. And she wants her poetry to be good, but she was clearly, she wasn't tapping in. She was trying to impress me, and it was obvious that it wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And so I picked up my complete compilation of E.E. Cummings, and I opened it up to something that revolves around Billy the Kid. Mm-hmm. And I said, here, read this. And she just said, wow, I've never read anything like this before. This has everything in it, and yet it's only a few words. And I kept thinking, I really do need to memorize this so I can impress people. And so the funny part of the story was I closed the compilation and I said, here, take it. And I went off and I taught my screenwriting class. And then right after that, I taught my playwriting class, and I was beginning to walk home. And the student was yelling at me from across the campus, Professor Braun, I got kicked out of biology class. And she ran over and she said, I got kicked out of biology class for reading poetry. And I thought, well, if that's, I think we've got something right there.
Your job is done.
If I may, let me see here. John Cote is one of my favorite poets. I really should memorize his stuff. His poem "Sally's Hair." You know, by the next time I come back to talk about Sam Shepard or whoever, I will memorize Sally's Hair. And I'm excited.
Fantastic.
That is really
Something
good stuff.
we will all look forward to.
Well, does that conclude our episode?
That concludes our episode. Thank you so much, Timothy Braun, for a wonderful conversation about many books, including Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And folks, if you're listening in the present and not in the future, you have to make that evaluation for yourself. Then know that June 8th is the book release for Lance's novel Why So Much? ? And it is at Malvern Books, as I've just said. And it's what time is it?
That's a Saturday, June 8th, 7:00.
Fantastic. And Timothy, do you have anything coming out?
I do. I'm going to be at Malvern reading with the creative writing faculty of St. Edward's University on Tuesday, April 23rd or 4th. It's Tuesday, I remember that, and I believe it's 24th. I will read my first Dusty story, and I'm going to be reading the opening monologue of my new play. It's an adaptation of Anton Chekhov's The Seagull.
Fantastic. And that's 2019.
That's
to all future
yes.
Right.
Yes.
people of the future who are probably crisscrossing the galaxy as Arthur Dent does in The Hitchhiker's Guide.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen. And good night.
Later.